I thought I'd do some reflections on the phrase watch and pray. This is a little more off the cuff than what I would normally do, but Jesus says these words to his disciples. What does it mean? Does it mean to, stay woke, like that phrase that you might have heard about being aware of social injustice, racial injustice, political injustices, corruption, being aware of that and praying against it? Does it mean being a spiritual sniper and taking out the powers of darkness, binding the demons, looking out for what Satan's going to do next and watching and praying against it? It's probably partly that. I'm sure Jesus didn't want us to be ignorant of politics, and he wants us to know what's going on. And probably, he would want us to know spiritually what's going on as well and preempt the enemy's attack when he makes us aware of it. But I was really interested to see the way that Jesus did this watching and praying thing. When he told his disciples to do it, he gave them an example of how to do it. So the emphasis was not on, so much on binding demons and casting out stuff. His modeling of watching and praying was focusing on something else. So I'm just going to read the scriptures that relate to that. Matthew chapter 26, verse 36 to 46. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time he went away and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So sleeping, the disciples were sleeping while Jesus was awake. So that's a metaphor. Jesus was watching and he was awake. That's a metaphor for being spiritually awake and spiritually watching. And the disciples were spiritually sleeping. They were not aware of what was happening and what they should be doing at that time so that they wouldn't fall into temptation. Another part of another gospel that shares this moment from a slightly different perspective is Mark chapter 14, verse 32 to 40. Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." He went a little farther and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." Then he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away and prayed and spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. So really interesting. Jesus didn't do any binding and casting out territorial demons, binding the spirit of murder in Jerusalem, or casting out the devil out of Judas. He had a completely different approach to watching and praying that maybe we would naturally think of when we think of watching in the spirit, being a watchman, that sort of thing. So he took his soul to God. That was what he did. He didn't try and anticipate like stopping the government from what they were going to do, stopping the powers that be, anticipating their every move, asking God to give him prophetic words about the future. He was just focused on his own soul, surrendering the anguish, the sorrow, and the distress in his own soul, his emotions, to his loving Father in prayer. That was what watching and praying meant. That was the example that he was giving of that. So I think it's great to know I think that's our first port of call in the times that we're living in. Even if we do all the other stuff and we have a huge amount of discernment about the times and the seasons that we're living in, about the government, even if we think God's told us what's going to happen with governments falling and rising, or us all being injected with a vaccine that has another agenda, even if we think we know all of that stuff, none of that's actually going to make a huge difference to us being able to withstand the spiritual forces that are coming against us if we don't take our own soul to God, if we don't discern what's in our own soul and actually surrender that to God, just the way that Jesus did. So for Jesus, it was his will that he was surrendering. That was part of his soul that he was surrendering. But the soul has four main parts. People usually think of it as being the mind, the will, the personality, and the emotions. So that's a good question for us to ask ourselves. What areas of our mind, soul, personality, and emotions are giving us anguish? Which ones do we need to take to God in watching and praying at this time? So what does your prayer look like? What brings you anguish? Is it, God, I'm in anguish over this addiction that I have that I can't seem to shake? Or is it, I'm in anguish over my finances, I just can't seem to stop worrying about it and fearing what's going to happen? Or is it a sick feeling in your stomach at the thought of losing a relationship that you're in? It just ties you up in knots with fear. What makes you cry? What makes you sorrow? What makes you feel distressed? Is it loneliness? Is your prayer to God going to be that you feel so lonely that you're afraid that you're going to do something stupid just to escape from that loneliness? Like getting high or getting into a relationship with someone who you know is not the right person. Is it insecurity? Is it putting your foot in your mouth? Is it lying? What are the things in your soul, your personality, are the things that grate on you, that give you anguish, that you think, man, I wish I could change that? And God is wanting us to surrender those things to him, to take them straight to him. Weaknesses, sins, worries, fears, sadness, anguish. God can handle it. And if we think that we need to confess these things to God, surrender them to God, and then fix ourselves immediately afterwards, that's not right either, because even Jesus Christ needed strengthening when he took the concerns and the worries and the fear, the blood, the sweat, the tears of his own soul to his Father. Even he needed strengthening supernaturally. So if the Son of God needed strengthening supernaturally to deal with the issues of his soul, how much more are we going to need supernatural strengthening? It says that an angel strengthened him after he had, prayed the 3 times. It was an angel that came and strengthened him. It says in one of the versions. And so, why do we think that we have to then solve our own issues even after we've confessed them to God? God might have a little step that we need to take, or steps that we need to take to get free from whatever it is, but he initiates that. He lets us know that we don't have the capacity to change our own soul or the anguish of our own soul. So I have been thinking about the importance of that, and especially in the time that we're living in. Imagine if Peter was with Jesus. Peter was sleeping. He didn't get quite click. didn't get the concept of watching and praying. He fell asleep while Jesus was watching and praying. And so Peter did not surrender the issues of his soul to God. Imagine if he had. Imagine if he'd stayed awake spiritually and he was praying to God with Jesus and surrendering the issues of his soul. Imagine if he said to God, God, I just have this insecurity that keeps popping up in me. I have fear. I feel like I have this streak in me where I am scared of people and what people think of me, and I'm scared of being a coward in a moment where I really need to be brave. I'm afraid that's going to happen. I'm kind of jealous of other people, and I keep putting my foot in my mouth and blurting things out and saying things that I shouldn't say. Peter was kind of half aware of those things already, because we know Jesus had rebuked him on a few things even prior to this point, but he didn't take that stuff to God. He didn't take the issues of his heart to God. He slept spiritually. He was sleeping. And so the consequences of that was that he did fall into the temptation of betraying Jesus, even though he didn't intend to. That stuff just like came out of him. What was in him came out. His soul issues came out when people questioned him after Jesus got arrested, and people were like, hey, aren't you friends with that guy? And Peter's like, no, what are you talking about? And then he beep beep, and he even swears and is like, I don't know him. Like, what are you talking about? Denies Jesus 3 times. And of course, Jesus still has mercy and restores him fully into ministry, but would have been easier for Peter if he had actually brought his soul, if he had actually watched and prayed in the same style that Jesus had and brought the issues of his soul to the Father. Then he would have withstood the trial that he was going through a lot more. So I think, I think that God's just been highlighting that to me. I hope that's of help to someone out there in these times that we're living in, that we don't need to spend hours and hours focusing solely on, scrolling through YouTube videos to find out what's happening with the pandemic and whether it is one, or to do other stuff that is aside, actually God probably views as secondary to the main concern, which is watching and praying with your own soul. Even if, as I said, even if you have the best discernment in the world and you feel like you know what's going to happen in the future, if you haven't dealt with the stuff that's in there and watched and prayed and surrendered that to the Father, then that stuff is going to derail your discernment anyway. If you have a little bit of fear in you mixed with discernment, fear will derail you off. And I can say that from experience. It's kind of ugly when your fear takes over, when you're discerning something that's happening spiritually, but then your fear, because you haven't dealt with that, takes over the discernment, and you become way more hypervigilant, way more fearful, worried, anxious, depressed than what you needed to be. And it can even cause you to see things inaccurately as well, even when you might have you might have some discernment that's accurate, but fear will cause you to see shadows that are not even there, things that are frightening, that are not even a threat if you haven't dealt with that in your own heart. So yeah, hope you got something out of that. I feel like I'm still processing it. Feel free to click on my Facebook page thingy to look at some other resources, free resources that are there. I think that's all that I wanted to share. So maybe a couple of questions to finish with. What are you in anguish or sorrow over? So what are you in anguish or sorrow over? And what in your soul, so mind, emotions, will, personality, gives you anguish or sorrow? And right now I think is a season, a time, well, you can do this anytime, but I think particularly now it's a time to watch and pray and bring those things to God instead of just ignoring them and sweeping them under the carpet. So much love to you. God will strengthen you in that process and give you supernatural help as you do that. Aroha to you all. Bye.